Oh dear, just as another huge scandal engulfs the BBC with serious allegations about MasterChef host Greg Wallace, we received the delightful news that the licence fee, an obligatory tax for the great privilege of looking at your telly, is to go up to £174.50. For the comfortably off, that is a rounding error. That's just a big shop at Sainsbury's. But for many others, deliberating over whether to switch on their radiator this evening, then that is a lot of money. The licence fee shouldn't be going up. It should be coming down to reflect these straightened times and to reflect the fact that broadcast technology is far cheaper these days, cameras, microphones, etc. And also to reflect the fact that a channel like GB News can broadcast 18 hours of premium live content every day for the price of half a sandwich and a cup of tea. There is certainly no wardrobe budget. Joe Rogan has the biggest podcast in the world with billions of downloads, a show that he effectively records in his garage. But oh no, the BBC has to have lavish resources paid for by you and I. Armies of producers and researchers. Stars like Gary Lineker on £1.4 million a year to read out football scores. Zoe Ball on £1 million a year to spin records. And top executives on six-figure salaries. The truth is that those BBC executives are barely able to contain their embarrassment at the taste and views of ordinary British people, with one top boss recently refusing to say if he found one of the few entertaining shows on the BBC, Mrs Brown's Boys, funny. Well, they're in the brown stuff now, as it's revealed 500,000 Brits stopped paying the licence fee last year alone. Now, many would argue the licence fee should go altogether. Legendary former BBC star John Humphrys has argued that this TV tax is no longer fit for purpose. Of course, the BBC haven't helped themselves by being so incredibly arrogant and out of touch. We could probably swallow this annual cost if the national state broadcaster was delivering for the whole nation, but it ain't. Instead, the public are served up shows like Have I Got News For You, Question Time and Doctor Who, which all have a perceived leftist slant, whilst letting hugely popular older stars like Ken Bruce, Steve Wright and Sue Barker go. They stood accused of an anti-Brexit bias following the referendum, and during the pandemic, the BBC narrative was pro-lockdown, pro-masking and pro-vaccine tyranny, none of which, in my view, has aged well. The BBC's coverage of the October the 7th attacks upset thousands of British Jews, with the former director of television at the BBC, Danny Cohen, calling the corporation institutionally anti-Semitic. An independent report suggested that the BBC had demonstrated an anti-Israel bias on more than 1,500 occasions. And The Telegraph today report a BBC whistleblower calling anti-Jewish attitudes at the BBC, and I quote, the norm. Oh, and their star presenter Gary Lineker described October the 7th, the single worst attack on Jewish people since the Holocaust, as the Hamas thing. Charming. So much of the BBC's output feels like it's made for the North London Negroni-swilling metropolitan elite, woke, university-educated liberals who are comfortably insulated from the consequences of the soft socialism peddled by Auntie. Meanwhile, presenters like BBC Radio 5 Live's Nihal Arthur-Nyika, he can announce that he's triggered by working with white people and that it affects his mental health with no consequence. It's bad enough that the BBC's output doesn't speak to the entire nation, with attempts to ban Land of Hope and Glory and breakfast TV presenters sneering at the flag. But what's worse is that the BBC can't even keep its own house in order. Reportedly, Hugh Edwards' shocking behaviour was known for years. There was Top Gear and the almost fatal death of Freddie Flintoff following accusations of negligence. The Strictly Giovanni Pernice row, of course. And now serious allegations about Greg Wallace of MasterChef. Now, one of the country's top lawyers, Mark Stevens, told Times Radio today that bad behaviour in a normal company just wouldn't be tolerated, but things seem to be different at the BBC.
Why is it that the BBC seem to be incapable of managing these kind of situations? Was it that they're turning a blind eye and they haven't moved on from the 1980s, or are the systems just not fit for purpose? What is it that's different about the BBC? Why are they failing in these circumstances? And why is this not coming out much earlier? And why is prompt action not being taken?
Why indeed? Now, it's a crying shame that an institution that we should love is so despised by many. But they've brought it on themselves. And this latest Greg Wallace scandal is another turn-off for a BBC that needs to get its house in order. With an income of £5 billion a year, how hard can it be? Well, very hard apparently, because new research suggests that the BBC hasn't scored an original hit for 5 years. There's a surprise. Perhaps the commissioners should dig their heads out of their backsides and get out of Islington from time to time. Our national state broadcaster has a problem. With not enough masterminds and too many pointless celebrities, the BBC is starting to look like the weakest link. Now, let me be clear that I like the BBC. In fact, I would go as far as to say I love the BBC. It's got an amazing heritage. It's a global brand. It gives us soft diplomatic power. I want it to thrive. I want it to survive. But at the moment, it's in a self-inflicted death spiral. Your reaction: is the licence fee increase worth the money? Are you happy to spend £147.50 or whatever it is? Just too much, isn't it? Let me know your thoughts. gbnews.com/your say. Let me hasten to add that GB News costs you out, and it never will. OK, tonight's top pundits, we have author and academic Dr. Lisa Mackenzie, journalist and communications advisor Linda Jubilee, and writer and broadcaster Peter Lloyd. Linda, how do you solve a problem like the BBC?
I'm not sure, because this has never really gone away, and it isn't just the BBC. It's television, because television attracts talent, and there is a power structure, and that power structure can be abused. Mm-hmm. It's certainly abused at the BBC, and it's a real worry. Whilst we don't know what's actually gone on with Greg Wallace, if 13 people have come forward with similar allegations, you can safely say something's going on and something needs to be investigated. And it's almost, with Greg Wallace aside, but with predatory behaviour, it's nearly always on an industrial level. So that we see with Mohammed Al-Fayed, for example, I think there's nearly 400 survivors of that abuse. And there will be, once you start lifting the lid on all of this, more and more will roll out. We haven't even heard the end of the Hugh Edwards story yet. But certainly, I was a newspaper journalist for several years before moving to Sky Television, moving into television. It was absolutely everywhere then, and it's everywhere now. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's a real worry.
Well, indeed. Now, Peter, of course, we don't know anything about the Greg Wallace allegations. And, I mean, of course, there's stuff floating around the press. We don't want trial by media. And there's no evidence at this stage to compare Greg Wallace to Hugh Edwards or Mohammed Al-Fayed or anyone. Innocent till proven guilty. You can say that about Greg Wallace. You can't say that about the BBC, because it's not the first time they've had a crisis like this.
Exactly. You only have to look back over the last few decades. You had Jimmy Savile, you know, you had
Rolf Harris,
Martin Bashir, you had Rolf Harris. You know, there's just a catalogue of these failings, and every time the BBC have been complicit in covering it up for their own gain. They want to protect their stars, even if they're behaving badly, because it's all about revenue and power and influence.
Is there any evidence they did that with Hugh Edwards? I mean, they would argue that once the allegations were made, they had a full...
there was a huge gap between the first complaint being made and them actually taking action. There was a huge gap. And that is just inexcusable.
And the wrong week for the BBC to put the cost of licence fee up, would you say?
Yeah,
I mean, it's only a £5, but the overall figure is massive.
It's astonishing, and it just decreases the value of money. I mean, I am of the opinion, you like the BBC, you want it to thrive.
I do.
I'm of the opinion that it's beyond reform and that it can't collapse soon enough. I just think it's so compromised that it can't be fixed.
So what would the brave new world for the BBC look like in your ideal scenario? Or would you axe it? Would you literally close it down?
Can't
Would you have
axe it. It's the
would you have a
public
fire
service
sale?
broadcaster.
Well,
Would you sell Gary Lineker on eBay?
I think it should
Buy it now for
it
tenner.
should be stripped down to the bare
Gary Lineker.
Yeah,
essentials.
it's to the
Okay.
basics.
No,
Yeah.
it really
but
should.
you
So
asked-
what would it be? Would it come out of general taxation? You'd lose the licence fee? Would you have just a small budget from central government to keep it going?
No, I think it should be a subscription service only.
Yeah, you
Now,
see,
Lisa, do you want to defend the BBC?
I do.
Because it's got
I do.
millions of viewers and listeners every week who couldn't be happy.
yeah, I do want to defend it, and I know that, and it's getting harder to defend constantly because the BBC has done some astonishing programmes and the dramas that they do. Our Friends in the North, the great BBC dramas that they've done, they've put money into. You wouldn't get that anywhere else.
Fawlty Towers, The Office, Only Fools.
And then also, you've got the local news. I really value local news, local radio. I really value that. But it is getting difficult to defend the sort of BBC schedule. For a start, MasterChef. Why is there 4 different types of MasterChef? I don't watch it. I hate it. But we've got it annoys me. MasterChef, the professionals. MasterChef, the celebrity. Ordinary MasterChef. It's on all year.
Because they lack creative ideas.
But
that's
ask
why.
yourself this: why did Michelle Hussain leave or announce her departure this week from the Radio 4 Today programme to go to Bloomberg TV?
Yes.
Now, I'm not rubbishing Bloomberg. I think it's a very, very, professional service.
Yeah.
And that's where she started her career. But 10 years ago, leaving the BBC's flagship radio programme to go to a niche channel would never have occurred to her.
There you go.
So what is that telling us about people's career strategy? Emily Maitlis, she's gone off and done Newsagents podcast, doesn't she? People aren't staying there. Andrew Marr's gone.
revealing her politics into the bargain,
Right,
Peter,
right.
along with John Sopel and others.
Yeah.
Well, they just can't help themselves, these people. They're supposed to be neutral, but they just can't help themselves.
I'm going to have my own personal gripe about this, actually, because once upon a time, the BBC did push through working class talent. So there was the Play for Today's, Dennis Potter started there, Ken
kitchen
Loach.
sink drama.
Yeah,
Yeah,
kitchen sink
yeah.
drama. Working class talent.
Yeah, but that
would come
doesn't
through.
happen now.
And that is what I think is the problem of the BBC. It's not connecting with any audience. It's connecting to an audience that it thinks is there.
It's in a bubble.
But it's not. And I think we can say that about many media organisations.
Fascinating. Well, look, I'll get to your thoughts about this at 10:30, but we've got a statement from the BBC regarding Greg Wallace. We are always clear that any behaviour which falls below the standards expected by the BBC will not be tolerated. Where an individual is contracted directly by an external production company, we share any complaints or concerns with that company and we will always support them when addressing them. And in relation to the Greg Wallace specific allegations, the Beeb said if issues are raised with us, we have robust processes in place to deal with them swiftly and appropriately. And Mr. Wallace's lawyers insist the claims are entirely false, saying the suggestion that Wallace, who has presented the popular BBC One cooking show alongside John Torode since 2005, engages in behaviour of a sexually harassing nature was entirely false.